the last speaker today.
Yeah.
This with these,
Yours.
continuing these fascinating talks, and our next speaker is Rafał Borysławski.
Yes, indeed. Yes, thank you.
Who is an associate professor in the Institute of Literary Studies at the University of Silesia in Katowice in Poland.
Yeah.
And Rafał's research is primarily concerned with Old English culture and literature and medieval culture, as it is associated with the field of social history. And Rafał deals with topics in between history, historiography, and philology. And we are also now moving to Old English examples,
Indeed.
away from the Old Norse to the Old English. And in Old English, you have dealt with romances, and you have also dealt with French literature.
Yes, a little bit. Something new came out. It's on Marie de France. Yes, it's, like
and visual culture.
Yes,
so
yeah.
you cover a large field. One of the topics is emotions.
Indeed.
And that is something that you will, I assume, relate to in the talk
Absolutely,
today.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I have not been so lucky to meet you before, Rafał, but I'm so happy to meet you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Pernille, you really made us feel so very much welcome. And I feel so very much welcome. I feel like already, I've known you for a while. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Yoav, for organizing this wonderful seminar. And thank you very much for staying here, and, to the people online just as well. I am obviously, sort of looking at a sort of different aspect of trauma. Yes, and I'm looking at the aspect which is closely related to trauma, the aspect of fear, which is in essence connected to the grand project that I am working on at the moment on the politics and poetics of fear in Old English literature and poetry in particular. And in several ways, is what I'd like to talk about is a certain appeal of fear, or maybe even a certain appeal of trauma, and that might sort of tap into, on the one hand, what Torvi was talking about earlier on in the morning, yes, in the sense that trauma is obviously a sort of transforming experience, yes, which nonetheless may lead to a certain rebirth, and reconfiguration, and on the other hand, also to what Jakob was talking about, yes, to the idea of power associated with that, yeah. And I could also have a sort of, if you allow me, yes, a kind of maybe unpleasant sort of references to the recent events, yes, and I'm thinking of the book that came out during the first presidency of Donald Trump, yes, by Bob Woodward, yes, the reporter who worked on the Watergate scandal, yes, and he approached Trump and asked Trump, what it was that Trump understood as power, and after a short while, Trump just gave one answer, one-word answer: fear. Real power is fear. That's what it's talking about. But I am not going to be talking about the idea of power as how do I go here? Yeah, again, I'm sorry, because I'd like to move to the next slide, and it's just good. It gets
a lot of cake.
It just kind of got sort of stuck on.
You can do this.
Now I can do it. Yes, okay.
Yes.
I was trying to do
no, because you were probably not. Yeah. Anyway, you probably weren't on it.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So apologies for this. Yes. So to give you the sense of what it is that I'd like to be talking about, obviously there is a lot of trauma in Old English poetry, as you may well imagine. The first thing that would come into mind perhaps would be Beowulf, for instance, and you might think of the context, the historical context, of the time when Beowulf is recorded in writing. The Danish invasions is of the late 10th, early 11th century. Yes, Hwatwe Gardena, we have heard of the Spear Danes. And in this way, Beowulf might also be a poem that is going to be looking at a certain reflection or working through trauma. But that's not what I'm going to be focusing on. Yes, I'm going to start looking at what's been described as the kind of Schauervolles Geheimnis, is the idea of the tremor or fear of God and the tremendous mystery of divinity, and I'm going to work on that as conceptualizing fear. I should have started the timer, sorry. As conceptualizing fear with reference to Old English fear, Old English wisdom poetry, And all of the poems or texts that I'm going to be talking about eventually, they come from the same manuscript, from the Exeter book, of which fragments you can see here on the slide. Yes, and one of the main points, yes, is the point about confrontativeness of this poetry. So I'll start with the idea of talking about fear as a kind of challenge, as a threat to one's power of acumen. So as a kind of game, yes, which you can see in Old English riddles, but also in Old English gnomic texts. And then, I'll try to move to the idea of fear as a kind of constructive concept, yes, which is also, I think, going to be visible in gnomic verse, yes, in particular the Exeter Maxims and also the Order of the World, but also, yes, in a kind of, if there's time for that, perhaps there will be, at least, for a brief but constructive reference to one of the poetic lives of saints, to the life of St. Guthlac, yes, who appears to be precisely on the kind of quest for fear, which ultimately is the quest for, wisdom of, the divine wisdom, is or wisdom as a sort of developmental, or fear as a kind of developmental path towards self awareness and towards, sort of, the Christian path of and ultimately towards salvation. So to start it off, I'll say that fear is obviously, one of the primary emotions that is responsible for the psychosomatic reactions of the survival mechanism. And in many ways, it is associated with heightened cognitive receptiveness. And because of this, is present in various contexts of Old English literature. It may be typically categorized there as a response to either of the two broad stimuli, the fear of the death of the body or the fear of the death of the soul, which are both mentioned by a early 11th century homilist, Elfrich, who commented on Christ's words, which you can see here in Matthew 10:28. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Be afraid of the one who can destroy both body and soul and body in hell. The latter of these, that is the fear of the death of the soul, is understandably more central to the ethical and moralizing substance of Old English verse. And anthropologically, it results from the biblical tradition that may be linked to the concept in the phenomenology of religion, which a German philosopher and Protestant theologian, Rudolf Otto, called the Schauervolles Geheimnis, is precisely this Mysterium Tremendum, yes, in his work titled Das Heilige. So the Timor Dei, which is present in the Old Testament tradition, in a number of Old Testament books, is obviously going to be powerfully reverberating, yes, with Old English Christian poetry, yes, and that the books where you'll find it range from the Old Testament books of Deuteronomy, Job, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Psalms, and Isaiah, yes, but also in several notable comments, yes, like the one from Matthew 10:28 in the New Testament. Understandably, then, the associations, these associations, they feature prominently in biblical exegesis and commentaries, and I'll mention just several of them. Yes, some of the examples is that we might begin with St. Augustine of Hippo and his On Christian Doctrine, where Augustine speaks of the idea of the necessity is to be moved by the fear of God towards learning His will, and it is what God supposedly instructs us to seek or avoid. Yes, the fear will naturally, as he continues, inspire reflection about our mortality and future death, and by nailing our flesh to the wood of the cross, as it were, crucify all our presumptuous impulses. And then, Augustine goes on to say that after these two stages of fear and holiness comes the stage of knowledge, and this is the area in which every student of the divine scriptures exerts himself, and what he will find in them eventually, and quite simply, is that he must love God for himself. Yes, and if we look at other sort of patristic writers of the early Middle Ages, is in Gregory the Great's Morals in the Book of Job, or Moralia in Job, we find Gregory working on the Book of Ecclesiastes, which was commenting on the Book of Ecclesiastes, which was believed to have been written by King Solomon, where again, to quote the translation by Mark Adrian, he speaks of the fear of God as something that will never allow us to pass over the good things that ought to be done. As it is said by Solomon, Gregory says, He that fears God neglects nothing, but because some do certain good things in such a way that they are not at all suspended from certain evils, well after it is said to fear God, it is also said to depart from evil. You know? In Old English context, if we look at Old English renditions of Psalms, yes, in the prose Psalms, yes, we come across the idea of Gottes Ehe or Ehelichnis, a Methodes Ehe, the word Ehe being related to the contemporary word or, obviously, is on a number of occasions, yes, but also yes in the metrical Psalms, yes, the comments on in one of the metrical Psalms here in Psalm 90 in the translation of Psalm 93, which actually departs from the Vulgate, is a comment that again strongly emphasizes the idea of fear as a lesson, yes. And he who strikes fear in all the peoples does not his threat come for nothing, as he teaches mankind much wisdom, yes. Which I think again reverberates with what we could hear earlier, and for instance, in the way politically, yes, fear was being used politically. Yeah. And one final, but I think a quite outstanding example of this specific application of the state of fear in the Old English homiletic context of the Benedictine reform of the late 10th, early 11th century, and in particular the homilies of Elfrich of Eynsham, who employs the theme in several notable sermons. Yes, this example comes from the sermon by Elfrich, which was the sermon for the third Sunday after Easter, which was customarily called Bedam sevenfold and Ungifa, on the sevenfold evil gifts, which actually revolves around Christian discernment. And Elfrich in this sermon juxtaposes 7 false gifts that the devil tricks people to accept with the 7 true gifts, 7 spiritual gifts that should suffuse every believer. And that is Elfrich's reworking is or sermon that is based upon the book of Isaiah, in which Isaiah speaks of the 7 spiritual gifts. The 7th and the most important of these true gifts, which is also one of the graces, is precisely that gift of Gottes Ehe. Gottes Ehe is so servodet thise la kastlicha gifa, and so gifu is angin alles wisdomes, and serve Gottes Ehe hath ne forlat henen thing. Yes, the fear of God is the 7th of these spiritual gifts, and that gift is the beginning of all wisdom, and he who has the fear of God lacks nothing. So Elfrich here essentially repeats in this passage is also the message of Gregory's Moralia, but in a different sermon, he also speaks of this sort of fear more pragmatically as a homily that is known as the first homily on Lazarus for the Friday of the 4th week of Lent, where Elfrich distinguishes between the 2 types of fear mentioned earlier, the fear of the death of the body and the fear of the death of the soul, yes, and warns against the destructiveness of the one which is clearly wrong. Yes. Alchman ondrad him dades to kime, ontwała him ondrada tere saule death. Ondrade swadu ondrade se death the kimtu. Every person fears or dreads the coming of death, and yet few dread the death of the soul. Dread the death of the soul as you dread the death that comes to you. Yeah. So to sum up this introductory part, we could obviously say that this Judeo-Christian understanding of fear of God delineates it not so much as the lack of metal or action, but as the virtue of prudence. It's the psychological reaction of negation, withdrawing or escaping from the stimuli that cause fear, is turned here into their opposites. It's as if sort of a kind of embarking on a kind of active search of fear. Perhaps, not sure if we could, go as far as saying that it's a sort of active search of being kind of traumatized by the fear of God, yes, as it were, and in this way transformed, yes. And the greater the fear of God, the more of that fear is desired, as it brings the good Christian closer to its transcendent cause. And as apophatic thinking implies thinking beyond the object of one's concern. This moralizing and therapeutic understanding of fear appears to be constructed on a similar principle. And it is so because the timor Dei, the fear of God, ultimately implies, and from the biblical perspective even facilitates, thinking about what lies outside of it. That is, thinking of wisdom and acquiring discernment. Yes. And what I would like to do right now is in the sort of second part of this talk, or the middle part of this talk, would be precisely to sort of offer a kind of reading of some of the passages that appear to be inviting into a kind of textual confrontativeness, yes, and intellectual confrontation, yes, as passages that that might also be read, from a perspective, as it were, of what what sort of lies outside these passages. Yes? So not necessarily treated as passages that invite to an exchange, yes, but passages that actually offer some sort of not only challenge but threat, yes, to one's you might say power of intellect, and in this way also to one's sense of personal honor, as it were, or intellectual honor, as it were. Yeah? And this is naturally in many ways perhaps evocative of what we would come across in Old Norse literature, yes, in Old Norse enigmatic tradition. Yes, if you think of the confrontations in Vaftudni's Maul, yes, or the kind of Ridley confrontations with King Heidrek, yes, or the confrontations of Gestumblindi, yes, where the riddles are obviously potentially quite dangerous, yes, in the same. The game of yes, the riddle guessing is quite dangerous, yes. So throughout the Old English collection of riddles that can be found in the Exeter book, yes, which would comprise about 93 or 97 again, depending on the editorial take on that, is riddles scattered across this manuscript. Yeah, we come across a number of confrontative statements, yes, which often end the riddles or are located towards their very end, just like saya hwetich hata, say what I am, which would be say what I am called, or saya hwet hyo hata, say what she is called, that appear altogether 13 times. Yes, other questions like fliege hwetich hata, inquire what I am called, yes, but also statements that other statements that sort of speak of this kind of invitation to a kind of game of wits, yeah, that directly hints at the fact that this is a kind of condition of declaring one wise enough, yes, or thinking enough, yeah, or intelligent enough. Yes, like in here in the first of the riddles, saya thonkolmon huamek brekte oprimes fathom. Yes, say learned man who frightens me from the embrace of sea waters. And the implication, obviously, of that is that if you cannot answer this riddle, you are not the thonkol man. Yes, you're not the learned man. Yes, or rechejev tukune, wiswaldaglau, huatsio wichtie. Yeah. So recite if you can, you wise in words, what this creature might be. Yeah, which again might traditionally has been read as a sort of, a kind of noble invitation, yes, which is meant to be alluring, yes, to the audience or to the members of the audience wanting to get involved in the game of discovery by sort of hinting at that that member of the audience's, as it were, intellectual capabilities. But at the same time, if you sort of, if you read outside of this, yes, you may actually see it also as a threat. Yes, that this is, if you fail to do it, yes, you are naturally deficient, yes, in these qualities. Yes, and a similar example could be found at the end of riddle 65. Yes, but there are also even sort of more, you might say, sort of striking, yes, examples, yes, of this. Yes. For instance, towards the end of riddle 53 or 55 again, depending on the editorial count, yes, which is quite perplexing until the present. Yes, within which you will also find, we will also find a number of references to objects that are clearly there to incite some sort of fear or awe. The riddle finishes is with lines nume thesis jedes on swarewe sehine on mede wardum sajan hu su wudu hata. Yes, so now reveal the answer to this composition. Whoever dares to say in words how that tree is called. Yes, so that's a this, you might say that the threat and the fear that ensue here appear double, because not only does the very answer to the riddle appear to contain a menacing aspect, it's quite a menacing riddle, it seems, but also the reputation of the one who faces the riddle is being put at risk, yes, and thus any invitation to a game of wits may be met with a disgrace of or degree of fear, is entailing either of the two reactions that the emotion always involves: flight, which in this case would mean abandoning the challenge, or fight, which obviously would be tackling of the challenge at the risk of its failure. Yeah? And one other, perhaps more complete example to close the section on riddles is of the threat of losing one's face is when confronting an impossible riddle is in riddle 45 or 47, traditionally meant to or understood to mean a book moth, yes, although I very much see it, and I was happy enough to read a recent article also by Michael Foyce, who sort of subscribes to this perspective also, is very much see it, the idea of a kind of ridiculing an incompetent reader. Is the entire riddle in translation runs like this: a moth ate words, I thought in it an astounding fate when I heard of that wonder that a worm should swallow the discourse of man, a thief in darkness devouring glorious speech in its strong place. Yes, and then the Old English line here highlighted: Stagias newas wichte the leula hevedam wordum swelg. The stealing guest was not any bit the wiser, although he swallowed those words. Yes. So the possible less obvious solution would sort of describe someone who consumes wisdom without benefiting from it, and in this way actually contributing to its destruction. Yes. And in this way, this solution sort of revolves around an ignorant reader whose incompetence the riddle reveals. Yes. So a riddle is a sort of, intellectual threat, yes, of intellectual destructiveness. It's just like, the riddles of Vafthrûdnir, the riddle game between, Vafthrûdnir and Odin, yes, quite literal is quite literal, sort of threat of destruction. And from these challenges of riddlic tones, yes, let's now turn to the expression of the constructively creative fear, which I think can be found in two of the Exeter book's gnomic poems. The opening sequences of maxims and the order of the world have not really been read in the way of them posing threats, and I'll just use I'll explain the meaning of these red arrows in the moment. Yes. Instead, the opening lines of these two gnomic texts, yes, again, all of these come from the Exeter book. They've been actually understood as sort of appreciating the humanizing degree of wishing to reach out to another person and to create wisdom by reciprocating it. And such aspects are clearly there, but if we reorientate our reading towards these statements as posing challenges, then the passages yield, I think, slightly different results, which I think correlate later with the sense of awe and deference to God that constitute the underlying chief messages of the poem. And there are earlier editors, and that's why I'm actually, using these images. George Philip Crabb and Eliot van Kirkdobbe may have sensed such ranges of meaning as by punctuating. This is no longer done in modern editions. By punctuating the opening statements of these two gnomic poems with exclamation marks. So if we look more closely at the invocations, to Maxims 1, from the Exeter book, we'll find that it is unveiled with a kind of demand, for bargaining over wisdom. And however, when it is scrutinized from, I think, an emotional perspective, then the mood does not necessarily seem only the kind of benign mood. And the very first demand may sound almost like an ultimatum. Ask me with wise words. And ask me, but only ask me with the words that are wise. And this would imply a twofold reaction. How to determine the wisdom of the words that are to be asked, how to determine the wisdom of a kind of, the right question, as it were, and what would the consequences be of the use of the words considered unwise. Flyga meg från wordum, nella dina färd onhalne tegol that du teopuskune, nella ich vemen dirne jesejan, giftume dina jehegekraft helest, und dina heortan jethortas. heoltan je thuchtas, yes, heoltan je thuchtas. Glewemen shalon jedum lixlan. And then God shall mon eras herian ferie, Father unsere, userne, fordon de he us at fremde geotode lief und lerne willen. Ask me with wise words. Do not let your mind or soul or spirit or heart, is a very capacious word, it seems, be secret. The mystery that you know most deeply. I will not tell you my secret if you hide the power of your mind from me and the thought of your heart. Wise men must exchange, wise sayings. And then first, man must extol the merits of God our Father because he incited life and transient will in us. And this succinct appeal, sounds forceful and decisive. And the passage, I think, evokes the sense of duty and obligation to engage in mutual revealing of wisdom. The implication is that this not only corroborates the status of those who do so as lewamen, wise men, but that it is also a Christian duty, as a sort of prayer-like reiteration of God's merits and a reflection of God's own sapience. The implied repercussion of failing to do so or failing to provide sufficient level of wisdom is grave, for it implies being ungrateful to God, who may as well deprive one of the transient will and life he incited. The threat of being disgraced in human eyes and of transgression against Christian obligation are clearly palpable here too, even if the more positive tones of grateful appreciation prevail later. And in the order of the world, the call seems to explicitly challenges the courage of the one who is eager or fus, eager, ready, or in haste to act, to reach out towards the bearer of wisdom, is the one described as wisne worthboran, wise bearer of eloquence, and ask him questions about Folieschaft, what's been ordained to be. And this resounds very, very much with kind of, Odin-like exchanges. Because we've got the idea of a much-traveled person that brings wisdom. Wilt du fus hale, fremdne monan, wisne worthboran, wordum gretan, frijan, fela jeonge, im Folieschaft bidan te jesedje, sidra jeszafta, krafta skindelice, quick rerende, da the doida gehwam, turchtum godes springe wundra fela, wera kneolisum. Will you, eager man, approach a strange man, wise bearer of eloquence? Ask the one much traveled about what's been ordained. Bid him tell you about the natural powers of great creatures, renewing life, which every day through God's degree and judgment bring many wonders to the progeny of men. So if we agree to view this as a statement that is to challenge one into an intellectual engagement, it hinges upon the word fus, or eager, ready in haste to act, because failing to respond to this challenge would denote the lack of eagerness and readiness on the part of those to whom the words are addressed, and consequently the risk, again, of losing face, as in the case of riddles. And the threatening dimension of the passage extends beyond such a simple confrontation, however, because this call is not merely to confront a wise stranger, but to question him with, again, the right kinds of words. And as previously, the terrifying consequence of failure concerned the choice of such questions, and even more gravely, the repercussions of overstepping the boundaries of what should be asked. And some 15 lines below in this poem, this is put very straightforwardly. Leod das lade, each the lungre shall, meo to des majenspent, maran jesejan, thone tu higekraftig, in hnevre meja mode jekripan, is din merkt forswith. Nistat mones je met, mold herinda, that he meja in hrevre, his hair he work furdora spilgan, thone him frea sile to onjetane codes ayen bibotis. Learn this law, I must quickly tell you of the measureless abundance of power, greater than your mental power may grasp in your mind. Is your mind very strong? Yes? It is not meet, not proper for men moving on earth to explore in their minds his exalted works further than the Lord himself allows them to grasp what he ordains. Yes? So this is, I think, perhaps more than an admonition. Is this phrase, is din merkt forswith? Yes, is your might very strong? Yes, sounds, I think, almost like an outright threat. Yes, although obviously posed in a good Christian cause. Yes? It puts the addressee in place and it questions, and the question rings, I think, as much with a genuine inquiry as with a potential menace. The fear that ensues from it is whether one is able to judge where the limits of what is allowed to be explored lie. In this sense, however, fear gains a motivating dimension of the quest for wisdom. The use of the word meotut for God, so the word that actually, is connected with measuring or meting out, measurer, not richten or shippen, corroborates the significance of established boundaries and yet also the threat of overstepping them. And this is clearly the message that resonates in the threateningly admonishing passage of the order of the world. And with this, we finally come to the second seemingly less conspicuous, but in fact more profound aspect, I think, of fear as an emotional environment in gnomic poems, because it hinges upon what constitutes the essence of the gnomic verse, that is, on its apparent statement of the obvious, the kind of reification of and reiteration of reality, and on the crucial verb that ceaselessly reaffirms it, the verb shall, must. Yes? Things must be the way they must be, as in Maxim's forced shall frösen. Yes? An shall inbindan forstes fetre fela merti God. Frost must freeze, and quoting further, only one must unbind the fetters of frost, the most mighty God, not go, but God. I apologize for this. Yeah. And critical approaches to Old English poetry have often, had problem with this, or attempted to make sense of these ostensible platitudes in saying, as for instance, what Paul Cavell called sententious generalizations, is that the body of the gnomic verse comprises, and with some scholars going as far as actually criticizing the merit of this kind of poetry. Yes, and this is, for instance, Tom Shippey, who harshly states that its wisdom, yes, tells us very little, very little more than what we might have already realized for ourselves. Yes, but here comes, if we sort of again, reorientate ourselves to what lies outside of this, I think the focus on their emotional environment allows for, I think, a re-examination of their apparent obviousness. Yes. By the almost meditative reiteration of divinely ordained reality, they also tacitly open a terrifying possibility of considering the reality from the perspective of either absent or overturned order. What if frost didn't freeze? What if God didn't command ice to thaw? The opposite of what must be is obviously what cannot be, or rather what happens when the man turns away from the divine warrant of this order. Either way, it is both a terrifying and startling prospect. And the environment of fear that emerges from this reading leads the audience to a powerful exercise in imagination and in wisdom. In this respect, it is akin, again, to the riddles, and in particular to one of the, to the creation riddle. But it is also an apophatic approach to God. Is paradoxical oppositions is that sort of constitute its the idea of God, or the essence. Is on the one hand, God is described through the attributes that constitute the divine order. On the other hand, God is described through the fearsome exercise in imagining the consequence of the lack of that order. And the emotional environment of fear in Old English gnomic verse becomes then a sort of poetically creative, motivational, wisdom and experience-oriented way of interacting with its textual manifestations. And it's consistent also with the patristic teaching, as I was talking about earlier. So to close this is like for instance, the fragments from the morals in the book of Job, is that the fear of God is never to pass over any good thing that ought to be done. Yes. And in closing, fear in its two modes that operate in Old English gnomic context, the one based on confrontative threat of intellectual insufficiency, and the other ensuing from both the warning against and yet an incitement to imagine the consequences of the unimaginable, is not only emotional, is not the only emotional environment is that the texts engage. Nonetheless, it appears to dominate over the emotions of anticipation, surprise, and appreciation, also present in the gnomes. For one thing, fear in the gnomes is interspersed with these other emotional states. For the other, its experience is clearly a form of grace. It is because ultimately it is the fear of God that has been described by Merrick or others as the form of medieval sublime. Yes. which is a sort of an invitation to engage with what again lies outside of the fear of God. Its creative potential in the gnomes leads to a Christian insight resulting from meditation, confrontation, and appreciation of the emotional environment of fear. And just closing is, and this would sort of explain, the parentheses in the title of this talk, yes, because if we look at the poems that are not necessarily associated only with gnomic verse, with wisdom poetry, yes, like in the Lives of Saints, yes, where you can sort of see the kind of pragmatic, application, yes, of what is presented in Christian wisdom, yes, especially in one of them, in the Life of Saint Guthlac, which is perhaps one of the earliest Old English saints, yes, related to the Fens area, yes, in the southeastern, present-day southeastern England, yes, who is a man presented in the poem, yes, and in Felix of Crowland's Vita Sancti Guthlacki, as a man who abandons, not first initially abandons the kind of the earthly ways of being a warrior and engages with the sort of monastic experience, and then sort of looks for an abode in the place that is famed for being the place of devils, yes, and as it were searches, yes, for the experience of fear, yeah, what is described there as the terror, dreadful and uncouth, the wickedness of the ancient foes, is their powerful and cunning art, yes, who would reveal their own physical form. So the poem is numerous, is actually abundant in the depictions of the terror of the kind of devilish opponents, yes, but this sort of engagement by Guthlac, yes, and the will to confront them, yes, is the actual sort of practice of the fear of God, yes, what is described here as the fear of God that becomes almost, the passion that he pursues. And without, citing the entire passage, and I promise I'm coming to the very end, this is very much consistent, yes, with monastic advice, yes, of early monasticists, yes, like John Cassianus, yes, or John Cassian, the hermit, yes, who would describe the profession, yes, of a monk, yes, or a hermit, yes, as the profession that is also characterized with the fear, yeah, which does not, in fact, frighten us off, yes, which in fact is something that should be pursued and should be exercised and should be practiced. Yes. Thank you so very much, yes, for your patience, and I hope I didn't exert too much of that. Yes. Thank you very much. Yes. I hope it made enough sense. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
It really, for me, rang a huge bell to looking at the wisdom poems and the riddles in the Epic poems that where we are used to, or we itself, but very often these, because they are concerned with wisdom, are very much contextualized with, or not with the Christian context. But I really think that your talk gave ideas about how to frame this type of poetry, and the riddles, the thread implied in them, that we find a lot of places. So that was really fascinating.
Thank you very much, Pernille.
The poetics of fear.
Thank you.
Time is running.
Yeah, it is. Yes.
I think we should have a question, and you must decide what to do.
Well, I mean, I don't know exactly if someone's coming after.
I think we have Gwendolyn's just raised her hand here. I'm sorry.
Yeah, maybe we should. Okay, maybe first let Gwendolyn.
First, perhaps first with online guest, because then we can continue.
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah, yes.
So I don't know if Gwendolyn, if you can.
Yoav, I think we need your
Gwen, if you don't mind unmuting yourself, or perhaps I don't know if we can hear you. Or...
Yes. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, yes, indeed. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. This was so interesting and really compelling. I had two thoughts. One very quick. I'm currently finishing a book that looks at the medical texts, and so kind of when you're talking about the book moth and the worm, how it sort of eats wisdom but doesn't retain it, I just sort of like popped into my mind, you know, these worms that like eat people's insides.
Yes, oh yes, yes.
And just the kind of like implication of sort of them taking into themselves the sort of humanness
in the soul and body, you'll find that also. Yes, this giant worm glutton. Yes, you know that. Yeah.
I mean, it's so great but so gross. I love it.
Yes.
And the other question that I had is your talk about sort of meditation on fear and with fear sort of got me thinking about Leslie Lockett's hydraulic model. And so I was kind of like wondering, you know, you gave a big nod right there, so I'm sure you've got a take on that. I'd love to hear sort of how you've thought about that in this context.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's a brilliant observation. Yes, and it's just that there is so much to put here. Yes, I mean the idea of the somatic experience of fear. Yes, or the somatic experience of emotions that she talks about. Yes, you know, the swelling of the breast. Yes, and you know, and the kind of, you know, increase and decrease. Yes, as it were. Yes, going up and down. Yes, I should think that if I were to, I mean, it's there obviously. Yes, and we could, you know, I could, you know, look at some examples and actually point to it, you know, quite literally in these sort of in the wisdom poems, or I think they lend themselves to this interpretation most wonderfully. Yeah? But what I wanted to add to this would be that in a sense, you know, the kind of the Christian experience, yes, that sort of big, like you know, the example of Felix of the example of Guthlac, yes, in the life of St. Guthlac, yes, where you have this kind of going down in order to go up, yes, you know, where the idea of being dragged to hell or being dragged into the demons down, yes, you know, to the lowest of fears in order to go up to the point where I didn't have time to cite that passage, but at some point, the demons themselves actually declare themselves to be afraid of St. Guthlac, yeah, and it's as if St. Guthlac is a sort of also kind of offering some kind of Christian grace to them by allowing them to experience the fear of God that comes through him. Yeah? So this sort of movement up and down and swelling and decrease is definitely there. And I, you know, as we all know, I mean, you know, Leslie Lockett's work, you know, has done so much. Is for you know, I mean, it really, you know, I think enables us to you know, to apply it is to a number of perspectives, and that very much including. And in a sense, you know, thank you for raising the point about the kind of the medical perspective, medical humanities, because what we're looking at, I think, is, and this is also what we were looking at earlier with Tolvi's talk, is a kind of therapy, obviously, yes, you know. So I'd say we're looking at sort of, you know, early medieval, you know, not only, you know, psychotherapy, but maybe even early medieval psychiatry, as it were, to some extent, is the healing of the soul. You know. Thanks so much, Gwen, you know, for your observations, and thank you very much for being with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And if I can just follow up really quickly, I think something else that your talk like really highlighted very interestingly, sort of along the similar lines, is this sort of continuity between emotion and thought, and between sort of emotion and the mind, that they're not kind of two separate things, but that they're sort of swimming in the body together.
I agree
somehow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then we saw it in relation to politics just as well. Yes, I agree. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Because time is close to running out, I think some of us can talk later.
Yeah.
But I think we should give a hand to you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then
I'll just go there. I'll just you can you can sit if you want. No,
we can sit here.
Whichever you
like.
prefer.
Okay.
No, I just want to say just a few closing words because
okay. So no, usually okay. It's the closing.
It's a closing word.
So
Yeah. I'll sit. Okay. Yeah. So I just want to say some closing words. Yeah. I kind of wish this was like another 2 hours or at least one more hour to this to this session, well, to this day, because it was quite, I think there was a lot of more fruitful conversations that we could have, and hopefully we'll have some of them over dinner. But I do like how you rounded things up, Rafał, because indeed, I feel like the three presentations and maybe my comments and people's questions, Pernille and Agnes, and of course others, I feel that we did come to some sort of organizing idea of trauma as a healing or a guiding. Let's say if we take Kuba's presentation to the more positive place, a guiding element of fear, trauma, grief, and all these emotions. I also really like how, I mean, you each focused on different things, right? Fear, grief, trauma, and we can see again, like I was trying to say at the beginning, how trauma as a concept doesn't just contain itself, it contains multitudes. You know, it contains, like, when you talk about trauma, what exactly are you talking about? There's so many things that can be contained with it. Yeah, so again, thank you so much for coming. I wish we had more time to kind of discuss this. Maybe, you know, this might be developing into something that we'll do again. We'll see with Pernille. But be as it may, I'm not going to ask you now for a book chapter, but of course, we can always think about collaborating in other various ways, which would be great. I'm not going to demand book deadlines now. That's enough of that. But again, but I do want to say thank you very much to Pernille for, first of all, helping me to organize this, but also for chairing so well. Yes. And yeah, and thank you, of course, to our guests coming from Poland and from Iceland, and of course to the people in the crowd. Yeah. And thank you, of course, to the people online, it was so fun to see people constantly come and, not abandon us. That was very fun. And yeah, so I wish you could eat. We have some sweets. Of course, whoever wants can eat from what's left. So, I mean, you can't, people at home, but that's life. So thank you very much. It was really great.
Thank you.
And if anyone at home has last minute comments, then, oh, thank you so much. Says Justine, Ines, thank you. Sabine, thank you. Gwen, thank you. I think that's everyone. Thank you all. It was so fun to see your names and, also see your faces in some cases. So yeah, thank you. And I'll end the recording. I'll try and make the recording available, if possible. So we'll see. I'll try and make the recording available, if that's okay. I'll have to run it by everyone, just for, yeah. I just need to stop the recording, you know how it works. Oh.